Hello and welcome to Global Lens. Over the next 30 minutes, we put the spotlight on all the top stories from around the world. I'm Parikshit Luthra. These are the big global stories we are tracking today.
I think we're going to have a deal with India, possibly, and that's going to be a different kind of a deal.
US President Donald Trump hints at a trade deal with India with much less tariffs if US companies are allowed to compete in the Indian market. India's top trade negotiator extends his stay in Washington as talks continue on the contentious agri and dairy sectors. More than 30 people killed in Gaza in the last 24 hours as Israeli attacks continue. President Trump says Israel has agreed for a 60-day ceasefire proposal and urges Hamas to accept it. More than 600 Palestinians killed in the last 5 weeks while waiting in queues for food assistance. Chinese nationals working at factories making tech giant Apple's products in India are asked to return to China. Sources say the move will hurt the transfer of technology. Add, the move is retaliatory and builds on China's restrictions on the export of rare earth metals and high-tech machinery to India. Let's go straight to the market action. Stocks on Wall Street are struggling for traction after an unexpected decline in private payrolls. The US private sector lost 33,000 jobs in June as against economists' expectation of 10,000 job additions. Tesla has reported lower than expected deliveries in the second quarter. Microsoft is cutting 9,000 jobs in US, which amounts to less than 4% of its workforce. All this is weighing on Wall Street. Now, here's how the Asian markets fared today. Indian benchmark indices ended lower amid a sell-off in financial stocks. Japan's Nikkei, South Korea's Kospi, China's Shanghai Composite also ended in the red, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng bucked the trend. However, stocks in Europe traded mixed. Our top story this evening, US President Donald Trump has hinted at reaching a potential trade deal with India, claiming it's going to be a different kind of deal. Addressing reporters aboard the Air Force One, President Trump said that the proposed trade pact will entail much less tariffs if US companies are allowed to compete in the market. This comes amid hectic negotiations between India and the United States, with India's top negotiator extending his stay in Washington. Both sides are at a stalemate on the contentious agri and dairy sectors. Remember, failure to strike a deal by the 9th of July deadline will attract 26% tariffs on Indian goods.
I think we're going to have a deal with India, possibly, and that's going to be a different kind of a deal. It's going to be a deal where we're able to go in and compete. Right now, India doesn't accept anybody in. I think India is going to do that, and if they do that, we're going to have a deal for much less tariffs.
Meanwhile, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh spoke to his counterpart in US, Pete Hegseth. Both leaders reviewed efforts to enhance defense cooperation between the two nations. In their first conversation since the military conflict between India and Pakistan, Singh thanked Hegseth for US's unwavering support in India's fight against terror. That's not all. The Quad grouping of the United States, India, Japan and Australia issued a statement that said, and I quote, "The Quad unequivocally condemns all acts of terror and violent extremism in all its forms and manifestations, including cross-border terrorism," end of quote. Addressing the gathering, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar strongly condemned terror and reiterated the broader strategic goal of the Quad. He also announced India's intention to host the next Quad summit. In fact, joining me now to discuss this further is Atul Keshap, President of the US-India Business Council. He's also a former US diplomat. Thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador Keshap. Are India and the United States close to an interim deal? Are we going to see one this week?
Well, I sure hope so, Parikshit. You know, the U.S. Chamber, the U.S.-India Business Council, all of our members want to see this deal happen. It's very important for the United States and India, the two greatest democracies on earth, to have such a deal. I understand the trade negotiators are in town and working away. Secretary Bessent said the other day that a deal with India is very, very close, and we are cheering wholeheartedly for this deal to happen.
Ambassador Keshap, we're also hearing that there's a stalemate on dairy and agriculture. Do you think both sides have been able to overcome those hurdles?
So I've been in a lot of negotiations in my life. I've negotiated with Russians, Chinese, Indonesians, Egyptians, Indians, Europeans. There's always a point in a negotiation where both sides get kind of frustrated, and there's this inclination and call to sort of just walk away and give it time. But in every one of those moments, it's important to push on through. The most notable example of this in my own life and career was the nuclear deal, where it got to a point where everyone sort of just said, all right, we got to just take a break. And there was a break for a while, but then everybody pushed on through. It is my sincere desire and hope that both negotiating teams will push on through, because the only people who will really be gleeful about this deal falling apart are, frankly, Beijing and Rawalpindi and others. We need to have this deal go through. It's important for optics. It's important for business confidence. It's important for investment and job creation in both directions. So my respectful hope and plea is that we get through whatever moment this is. This is always a case in every tough negotiation where both sides have to really accept that they have to make some compromises and accommodations in order for it to go through. It is my hope that we will push through and make it happen. It is good for both of us.
What would be the Chamber's view on the ideal tariff arrangement under the deal?
Well, look, I mean, the Chamber's view, ideologically and theologically even, is that zero tariffs are the best for ensuring the greatest amount of prosperity and happiness and consumer choice. And so we've been on the record many times about that. If we can get to a point where we have the minimal amount of tariffs between the United States and India, where we also have the minimum amount of non-tariff barriers, because it's not enough simply to reduce your tariffs. You have to be sincere about reducing all kinds of government machinery and bureaucracy and regulations and red tape that would impede the movement of goods, despite or having a low tariff regime. So if both governments can come sincerely to a point where they realize that having truly free trade between the United States and India is good for both of us. It helps grow our economies faster. It's good for consumers. It increases consumer choice. It catalyzes growth in both countries. It creates new opportunities. Then I think we will have really, truly served our countries well with such a deal.
Ambassador, will we see a 10% tariff as a starting point of the interim trade deal?
So look, this is something that the trade negotiators have to figure out, right? And they need to be able to have their negotiations in private in order to come to a deal that they can then take to their leaders for ultimate approval. And it is best when such negotiation is done in private. And I actually commend both sides, America and India, for doing so much of this important business in private. We are two very large democratic nations. Leaks are always an issue, but I feel that these negotiations have been very disciplined. So here's where I look at it. Business people, executives, investment committees of large firms, Indian or American, want predictability. They want to know that if they're going to invest $5 billion in a semiconductor plant, or they're going to invest $8 billion in a critical mineral capability, that they have a predictable, stable, transparent, very clear regulatory and tax and tariff regime. And if they can have that predictability, then it's very easy to go to an investment committee and say, we've run the numbers. This is what makes sense. We should move ahead. One of the many reasons I left government is that I wanted to make sure that we could achieve the potential of the US-India economic relationship. Predictability is very important. If this trade agreement, if completed, and I very much hope it will be, offers that predictability, even if there is a baseline tariff in both directions, business can price that in, as long as it stays very predictable.
India has kept agri and dairy out of all trade deals. Will US respect India's sensitivities?
So I can't speak for the US government. I don't know what their thinking is and their insight is at this moment, but here's my perspective. India is a country that has made enormous strides in growing its economy, in uplifting the poorest segment of society, in transforming the lives of Indian people so much for the better compared to what I saw in the 1970s, 80s, 90s coming to India. All of that's good. But it is also true that the Indian agricultural sector not only employs an enormous proportion of the population of India, but also represents an increasingly smaller proportion of the GDP of India. And if you contrast that with agriculture in Brazil or in America or in other places around the world, India hasn't had the waves of modernization that other countries have had. And it has been at a certain, it has certainly ensured a certain political stability and predictability, which is very important in a country with hundreds of millions of people in the agricultural economy. But it also hasn't facilitated innovation that would actually increase incomes, farm incomes, help people transition into more efficient ways of living and ways of working. And so, in a way, if India were to look at this as an opportunity to inject a measure of innovation into its agricultural economy in a way that can actually catalyze growth of revenue, economic growth, help people transition into higher skilled jobs, it could actually be viewed as a positive. And, there's been some attempts at agricultural reform in the past, and India is a very complicated democracy. I respect the challenges of all of that. But I see this as potentially making a benefit and a blessing out of a trade negotiation. And you've seen other countries do this in the past with trade negotiations. So let's see what comes of it. But I do think that a little bit of pressure may be helpful in this case.
Right. Ambassador Keshap, Rajnath Singh has urged Pete Hegseth to speed up deliveries of pending contracts, including those of Apache helicopters and 404 engines. Will that happen? And will we see traction in the defense manufacturing collaboration between India and the US?
Let me answer the latter question first. I think there's an enormous scope for collaboration between the US and Indian defense industries, especially as you look at the track record of performance of Indian weapons platforms during Pahalgam. India has shown that it has made some really good indigenous systems, and we should see how we can leverage that for broader partnership in order to supply excellent weapons platforms to the entire free world. And there's ample opportunity for collaboration between American firms and Indian on things like drones and on automated weapons systems and on so much else that is indicative of being able to perform well on the modern battlefield. If you look at what's happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Ukraine and Russia, between Iran and Israel, it is clear that modern warfare is accelerating very fast. And Indian companies are very good at this. Some of them are members of USIBC. I think if American members and Indian members of USIBC and others in the ecosystem are able to collaborate on developing these 21st century weapons platforms, it will be good for our countries because the democracies need to show strong deterrent capability and they need to work with one another. And I think this is where, respectfully, government ought to get out of the way. Government is very heavily regulates the defense space, and government steers things toward government contractors and state-owned enterprises. But what government ought to do is let the private sector collaborate. On the engines that you mentioned earlier, I think it's everyone's intention that these products get delivered as quickly as possible. One of the problems that U.S. defense suppliers face is that we have to supply to the Pentagon. We have to supply for very urgent reasons of combat, like recently with Iran and Israel, or in Ukraine, Russia. And then there's also just global supply chain pinches that are still being felt 4 years after the pandemic. And so we need to ease out these kinks. Some of these parts that are in these engines are very highly engineered and very hard to come by. And I think there has been a very good discussion between America and India about speeding this up, as you mentioned, and the companies are trying their level best. It's a complicated thing to build an engine. There are a lot of components from a lot of places, and they are working their hardest to make sure they can deliver.
And finally, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has said a more focused Quad will help deliver better. How do you see this in light of the critical minerals partnership, especially when we are seeing a major crisis around rare earth magnets?
Thanks, Parikshit. So I've worked on the Quad since 2005. And, it's had its fits and starts, and now it's coming along very, very well. We just had the ministerial meeting of the Quad here in Washington yesterday with Minister Jaishankar visiting from India. Look, the Quad is an excellent platform for the four greatest democracies of the Indo-Pacific to fulfill Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's vision of a democratic diamond, ensuring the happiness of this region and helping ensure the sovereignty of this region through a free and open Indo-Pacific. What we need to do urgently is learn the lessons of the pandemic. We have a fantastic diplomatic coordination, military coordination, intelligence coordination. All those things are good, but we need to integrate the lessons of the pandemic. And what are those? We need to ensure resilient, secure supply chains. And my respectful suggestion to the governments would be start a process with business to talk about what it takes to shore up those supply chains and then put real money toward it to incentivize the private sectors of these four countries, these open societies and open markets, to ensure that our supply chains are never again subjected to the risks of exposure that we had during the pandemic. I would note that we just had in Washington yesterday, members of USIBC attended the very first ever Quad outreach to the business community. And it was on critical minerals, as you said. But critical minerals is just one dimension. There's also pharmaceuticals and advanced precursors for pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, key electronics for the defense industry, and so much else besides. We cannot afford to have our free citizens exposed to supply chain risk like they were during the pandemic. So this should be an urgent workflow for the Quad, and I hope that they will take it up.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Keshap, for joining us. A quick look now at the other headlines we are tracking from around the world. President Donald Trump has announced that the United States has struck a trade deal with Vietnam. Trump made the announcement on Truth Social and said more details were to follow. This comes just a week before the 46% reciprocal tariffs on Vietnam was set to take effect. The U.S. Senate has passed President Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill by a razor-thin margin. After days of heated debate and an all-night session, Vice President J.D. Vance cast the tie-breaking vote. The legislation is likely to face challenges in the United States House, where Republicans cling to a thin majority. US-based media company Paramount Global has agreed to pay $16 million to settle a legal dispute with President Donald Trump. The dispute was over a CBS interview featuring former Vice President Kamala Harris. Trump filed the lawsuit alleging that the channel deceptively edited a 60-minute program to favor Harris, his presidential election rival. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos has sold over 3 million shares of the company, raking in $737 million. The sale is a part of a pre-arranged trading plan, allowing Bezos to offload up to 25 million shares through May 2026. The billionaire had indicated that he would roughly sell $1 billion in Amazon stock annually to fund his space venture Blue Origin. Time for a short break, but don't go anywhere. Trump says Israel has agreed to all the necessary conditions for a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza. Will Hamas accept? We decode this with Eylon Levy, former Israeli government spokesperson, on the other side. Welcome back. US President Donald Trump has announced that Israel has agreed on terms for a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza. He also warned Hamas to accept the deal before conditions worsen. Hamas has reportedly suggested that it is open to a ceasefire agreement that puts a complete end to the war, but it stopped short of accepting the US-backed plan. Israel has not yet publicly commented on Trump's announcement. However, Israel's strikes on Gaza continue, with more than 30 people killed in Gaza in the last 24 hours. Meanwhile, more than 600 Palestinians have been killed in the last 5 weeks while waiting in queues for food assistance. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet US President Trump as well as the Trump administration's top officials at the White House next week. In a post on social media, Netanyahu said the meetings come in the wake of Operation Rising Lion that targeted Iran's nuclear and military installations. After multiple failed attempts at a truce between Israel and Hamas, will there finally be one? Joining us now to discuss this is Eylon Levy, former Israeli government spokesperson. Thank you for joining us. Eylon, let me begin by asking you, will this now lead to talks which will eventually end this war and complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza?
We can only hope that we are approaching an end of the horrible war that Hamas started nearly 2 years ago. But the ball is now in Hamas's court. President Trump says Israel has agreed to the terms of a ceasefire, and Hamas now needs to agree. It needs to release the hostages, and crucially, this will allow time for a diplomatic solution for the day after the war. But the day after the war must mean the day after Hamas. Israel is demanding this war has to end, with Hamas laying down its arms, its leaders going into exile, and allowing a new government in the Gaza Strip that will focus on peaceful reconstruction instead of trying to build Hamas's war machine against Israel. So remains to be seen how Hamas is going to act, but positive news that Israel may be getting at least some of the hostages back. They've been so cruelly held in tunnels, and time for a diplomatic solution for the world to tell Hamas, it's game over, time's up, you need to relinquish power.
Right, but Eylon, more than 56,500 people have been killed since this war began. More than 130,000 have been wounded. Isn't this a large enough cost of war? Isn't it time for Israel to stop the offensive?
Well, Israel's goal is to eliminate the risk of another October 7th massacre, because the first thing that Hamas did after it invaded on October 7th, butchered Israelis at a music festival, massacred families in their homes, and took 250 hostages, was to promise to do it again. In fact, there are still sirens in southern Israel because Hamas is still firing missiles at Israel. So what Israel wants is to make sure there's no risk that a jihadi Islamist army on our doorstep can invade and take hostages again. There has been a terrible cost to this war. Too many people have been killed, too many people have been hurt. But the responsibility lies with the terrorist organization that launched this war and refuses to end this war by letting go of those poor hostages and letting go of power.
Right. Now, when it comes to ending this war, what is the diplomatic solution? And will you be making the diplomatic solution? Will the Israeli government want that solution to be a part of any agreement to end the war as well?
The diplomatic solution runs through Qatar, because Qatar is not a mediator. Qatar is Hamas's patron. Qatar has been pushing since the beginning of the war for a ransom that would leave Hamas in power, basically telling Hamas to keep the hostages until it gets the terms that it wants. Hamas's leaders live in Qatar. Qatar can end this war tomorrow if it tells Hamas's leaders they must release the hostages, or they'll be extradited to the United States to face trial for crimes against humanity. So it's important that if we get a 60-day ceasefire, we don't just run down the clock and then Hamas continues to rain terror inside Gaza. The Arab states must pressure Hamas to lay down their arms, to go into exile, and allow for a new government with the backing of moderate Arab states that will mean that Gaza is no longer a base for terrorism against Israelis, and that the people in Gaza are no longer under the control of the Hamas regime.
Right. How are you going to achieve this? And will you be working on the solution with the United States? Because Hamas will not accept that. Hamas wants an unconditional end to the war. They want a complete pullout of troops as well. Will Israeli government do that? Or would you want Israeli forces presence to remain in Gaza even after the war comes to an end?
That's exactly right. Hamas does not want to end the war that it started. Hamas is holding on to 50 hostages. 20 of them are still alive as bargaining chips to make sure it survives the war it started, so that it can start preparing the next October 7th massacre and preparing for the next war against Israel. And Israel wants this to be the last war against Gaza. And that's why the terrorists who started this war have to lay down their arms and relinquish power. So we need pressure from the whole Arab world on Hamas to tell them, after the war, you can't govern Gaza anymore. The concrete that goes in has to go for people's houses. It can't go to the military tunnels underneath Gaza. Reconstruction can't begin if it means the reconstruction of Hamas, or we will be in another war all over again. So Israel is looking for an end to this war that puts Gaza in the hands of local Palestinians operating under international Arab leadership who do not want war with Israel, And Israel will want to maintain security control in Gaza and probably maintain a perimeter around Gaza so that it can stop any terrorists using that territory to invade Israel. Because the Gaza Strip is, only a couple of football fields away from houses inside Israel. And we cannot take the risk that this territory will be a launchpad for more attacks by jihadists like Hamas in the future.
Right.
This has to be the last Gaza war.
Okay, now in the backdrop of that short but intense conflict that Israel had with Iran, does Israel have the wherewithal to continue with this conflict against the Hamas if the talks were to fail and you don't get a deal on your terms?
Over the last 2 years, the Iranian axis of terrorist armies across the Middle East has collapsed. Israel just launched a 12-day campaign to destroy the Iranian regime's nuclear facilities. And even Hezbollah, Iran's proxy army in Lebanon, didn't come to Iran's help. It was all alone. There's now talk of possible peace talks with Lebanon and Syria that are trying to break free from Iranian rule. This is an amazingly positive development towards peace and stability in the Middle East. And in all that, Hamas is alone. Israel is able to divert military forces towards Gaza if need be, and therefore it's able to, wave a big stick at Hamas and say, if you do not agree to end this war, to free the hostages, to relinquish power, then we can continue this war against this terrorist organization. And everyone now needs to be demanding, it's time for this war to end. Hamas has to free the hostages already. We know they're being abused in tunnels under Gaza. It has to free the hostages. It has to lay down its arms, and it has to let the whole Middle East move on towards a better future of peace and stability and prosperity.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Eylon Levy, with those
pleasure as always,
and your view on the current situation and around the ceasefire as well. Let's move on and get you more news from around the world. The final season of the Squid Game has set a new viewership record on Netflix, raking more than 60 million views in the first 3 days of its release. As per Netflix's latest top 10 ranking, Season 3 bagged the most watched title. It has also already climbed to number 9 on Netflix's list of most popular non-English TV series. Canaletto's Dubai successfully tests electric air taxi, which was developed by Joby Aviation. The testing included a series of piloted vertical takeoff and landing wing-borne flights. With this success, the company is now eyeing for a 2026 launch of its commercial air taxi services. Wimbledon saw some big upsets early on in the tournament. Women's number 2 seed Coco Gauff was stunned by Ukraine's Diana, while Jessica Pegula also suffered a first-round exit, marking the first time in Open-era history that 2 of the top 3 women's seeds are out on day 1. On the men's side, number 3 seed Alexander Zverev was ousted in a 5-set thriller by Arthur Rinderknech. Other high-profile exits include Musetti, Holger, Rune and Medvedev. On Final Cut this evening, thousands of Turkish opposition supporters gathered outside the Istanbul municipality building in a rally to mark the 100th day since Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was arrested. The crowd chanted anti-government and pro-İmamoğlu slogans. Protesters clashed with the police and several were arrested. We leave you with these visuals. That's all on Global Lens. Thank you for watching and goodbye.